Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Valiant and watched the stars shift on the main screen. His ship had been traveling for 3 months through deep space when the scanners picked up something that made his heart race. The readings showed a massive structure ahead that was clearly not natural. It was too perfect and too big to be anything except alien technology. Morrison called his crew to battle stations but kept weapons powered down. This was humanity's first contact with alien life, and he wanted to do it right. The structure ahead looked like a space station that could hold 1 million people. Its surface was smooth and dark with strange lights that pulsed in patterns humans had never seen before. Admiral Lisa Grant arrived on the bridge within minutes. She had been sleeping in her quarters, but the alert brought her running. Grant was the highest-ranking officer on the mission, and she would handle all diplomatic talks. Behind her came Dr. Alex Turner, who studied alien life, and Colonel Ryan Webb, who planned military strategies. The communications officer picked up signals coming from the alien station. The patterns were complex, but the ship's computer started working to understand them. After 2 hours, the computer found basic mathematical concepts in the signals. The aliens were trying to talk. Grant ordered Morrison to move the ship closer, but to keep their distance. She wanted to show they were peaceful but not helpless. The Valiant moved forward slowly while sending mathematical responses back to the aliens. The exchange continued for several hours as both sides worked to build a basic language. The first alien message that made sense came 12 hours later. It said they were the Zelthak Empire, and they ruled this part of space. The message was cold and direct with no warmth or greeting. It told the humans to state their purpose or be destroyed. Grant responded that humans came in peace and wanted to trade knowledge and resources. She explained that humanity was new to this part of space and sought friendship with other intelligent life. The human message included pictures of Earth and information about human culture. The Zelthak response took 6 hours to arrive. They agreed to meet face-to-face on their station. The message included complex instructions for docking and warnings about weapons. Any human ship that showed hostile intent would be vaporized instantly. Morrison felt nervous as he piloted the Valiant toward the alien docking bay. The station was even bigger up close and clearly very old. Its technology looked far more advanced than anything humans had built. Weapon systems tracked their movement but did not fire. The docking process was smooth despite using alien technology. The Zelthak had sent technical data that let human engineers adapt their ship systems. When the docking clamps engaged, Morrison felt a small vibration through the ship's hull. Grant led the diplomatic team through the airlock and into the alien station. The corridor beyond was tall and narrow with walls that seemed to absorb light. Strange symbols covered every surface, and the air smelled like copper and ozone. The artificial gravity felt slightly heavier than Earth normal. 3 aliens waited in a large chamber at the end of the corridor. They stood nearly 8 feet tall, with gray skin that looked like leather. Their faces were narrow, with large dark eyes that showed no emotion. Long, thin arms ended in hands with too many fingers. The lead alien introduced himself as High Commander Vexthon through a translation device that hung around his neck. His voice was flat and mechanical without any feeling. He studied the humans, like they were insects under a microscope. Dr. Turner noticed how the aliens watched every human movement and expression. They seemed fascinated by the way humans use their hands while talking and how their faces changed to show different emotions. The aliens took detailed notes on small devices they carried. The talks began with basic trade discussions. The Zelthak wanted raw materials from human space while offering some of their technology in return. They spoke about trade routes and shipping schedules with cold efficiency. Nothing they said showed any warmth or humor. Colonel Webb noticed something troubling during the negotiations. The aliens kept asking about human military strength and colony locations. They wanted detailed maps of human space and information about how many people lived on each world. When Webb asked similar questions about Zelthak territory, the aliens refused to answer. One alien translator named Sektar made comments that bothered the human team. He referred to humans as emotional primitives who were driven by chemical impulses instead of logic. He said human behavior was unpredictable because they let feelings control their actions instead of cold reasoning. Dr. Turner began researching the Zelthak Empire using the station's public databases. What she found made her worried. The Zelthak had contacted 17 other species over the past 1,000 years. None of those species existed anymore. The records showed they had all been either enslaved or completely destroyed. High Commander. Vexthan seemed pleased with the human responses during negotiations. He told his assistants that humans appeared weak and easy to manipulate through their emotions. The Zelthak had studied human facial expressions and body language during the talks. They believed they understood how human minds worked. The first day of meetings ended with both sides agreeing to continue talks. Grant felt hopeful about building a peaceful relationship with the Zelthak Empire. Morrison was less sure after watching how the aliens studied his crew like laboratory specimens. Doctor. Turner spent the night reading everything she could find about previous Zelthak contacts with other species. The patterns she discovered filled her with growing dread. Every first contact had followed the same basic steps. Peaceful meetings led to trade agreements that gave the Zelthak detailed information about their new neighbors. Then came demands for tribute and submission. Species that refused were wiped out completely. The next morning, Turner tried to share her concerns with Admiral Grant, but the talks were already beginning. Grant ordered her to stay quiet and let diplomacy work. The future of humanity might depend on these negotiations, and Grant would not let fear ruin their chances for peace. High Commander Vexthan entered the meeting chamber with what might have been a smile on his alien face. 6 months had passed since the first meetings with the Zelthak Empire. Captain Jake Morrison was reviewing supply reports in his quarters when the emergency alarm started screaming through the ship. He ran to the bridge where his communications officer was trying to make sense of dozens of distress signals coming from human colonies along the frontier. The messages were broken and full of static, but the meaning was clear. Colony after colony was under attack by Zelthak forces. The aliens had struck without warning using weapons that tore through human defenses like paper. Morrison felt his blood turn cold as he listened to the desperate voices calling for help. That would never come. Admiral Lisa Grant arrived on the bridge looking pale and shaken. She had been in contact with Fleet Command, trying to understand what was happening. The reports coming in painted a picture of complete disaster. 12 human colonies had gone silent in the past 4 hours. The attacks were coordinated and devastating. Colony. Harmony 7 was home to 50,000 people, including families with young children. Communications officer Kate Phillips had been stationed there to maintain contact with the exploration fleets. Her final transmission came through filled with screams and explosions in the background. Phillips' voice was steady despite the chaos around her. She reported that Zelthak ships had appeared without warning and begun orbital bombardment of all major cities. The colony's defense platforms had been destroyed in the first minutes of the attack. Civilians were trying to evacuate, but the aliens were targeting the escape ships. The transmission cut to static just as Phillips was describing. Alien soldiers landing near the refugee camps. Her last words were about children crying for their parents who would never answer again. Morrison felt something break inside his chest as he listened to the recording. Fleet Admiral Tony Blake sent new orders to all exploration ships. They were to investigate the attacked colonies and rescue any survivors they could find. Morrison plotted a course for New Denver Colony, which had been one of the first targets. The journey would take 3 days at maximum speed. Dr. Alex Turner spent the trip analyzing everything they knew about Zelthak military capabilities. The aliens had clearly been planning these attacks for months while pretending to negotiate peace treaties. Their technology was far superior to human weapons, and their strategy was flawless. Colonel Ryan Webb studied the attack patterns and found them deeply disturbing. The Zelthak had not tried to capture strategic targets or valuable resources. Instead, they had focused on population centers where families lived. The attacks seemed designed to cause maximum suffering rather than military advantage. The Valiant dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the new Denver system. Morrison expected to find wreckage and debris, but what he saw was much worse. The colony was still intact but completely silent. No ships moved between the planets and no signals came from the surface. Scan reports showed that the main colony, domes, were still pressurized and had power. Life signs indicated that thousands of people were still alive on the surface. Morrison felt a spark of hope until he noticed the Zelthak ships in orbit around the planet. They were not attacking anymore, but they were still there. Dr. Turner picked up energy readings that made her stomach turn. The Zelthak were using some kind of scanning technology to study the human survivors. The scans were focused on areas where families with children had taken shelter. Turner realized the aliens were conducting experiments on living humans. Morrison took a small team down to the planet's surface using a stealth shuttle. They landed far from the main colony and approached on foot through the forest. What they found in the settlement made Morrison want to scream with rage. The Zelthak had sorted the surviving population into different groups. Strong adults were forced to work in mining operations that stripped valuable materials from the planet. Children were kept in separate buildings where alien scientists studied their behavior and emotional responses. Morrison watched through binoculars as Zelthak. Soldiers forced human families apart. Parents who tried to stay with their children were beaten unconscious and dragged away. The aliens showed no emotion during these separations, as if they were moving cargo instead of destroying lives. Ben Rodriguez was one of the survivors who had managed to hide from the initial roundup. He told Morrison about the first days after, the attack when humans tried to fight back. The Zelthak soldiers seemed confused by human tactics that focused on protecting the weak instead of preserving military assets. Rodriguez described how human civilians had charged alien positions with nothing but farming tools when the soldiers threatened their children. The attacks were hopeless and suicidal, but they bought time for some families to escape into the wilderness. The Zelthak could not understand why humans would choose certain death to save people who could not fight. The alien scientists were particularly interested in human emotional responses to separation and loss. They recorded everything when families were torn apart and studied the recordings for hours. Rodriguez said they seemed baffled by the way humans grieved for lost loved ones, even when it served no practical purpose. Morrison found evidence of medical experiments in one of the alien research facilities. The Zelthak were trying to understand human brain chemistry and the biological basis for emotions like love and loyalty. They seemed to view these feelings as diseases that needed to be cured through surgical procedures. Dr. Turner discovered computer records that revealed the true scope of Zelthak plans for humanity. The aliens intended to use humans as a slave, labor force after removing their capacity for emotional attachment. They believed that humans would be more efficient workers if they could not form bonds with each other. Colonel Webb located several groups of human survivors hiding in the mountains around the colony. These people had seen their families killed or captured and were slowly dying from starvation and exposure. Webb organized rescue operations to evacuate as many as possible, but the Zelthak patrols made it extremely dangerous. Morrison made the difficult decision to retreat after saving less than 200 survivors out of 50,000 colonists. His ship was not designed for combat, and the Zelthak forces would destroy them if they stayed longer. As the Valiant pulled away from New Denver, Morrison made a promise to the people they were leaving behind. The rescued survivors told stories that spread through human space faster than the official military reports. They described alien soldiers who laughed while human children cried for their parents. They talked about experiments that turned normal people into empty shells who could not feel love or hope anymore. Admiral Grant received Morrison's full report and forwarded it to Earth, along with her recommendation for immediate military action. The evidence was clear that the Zelthak had never intended to honor their peace treaties. They had used the negotiations to gather intelligence for these attacks. Morrison stood in the ship's cargo bay where the survivors huddled together, sharing blankets and trying to comfort each other. Many of them had lost everything, including family members they would never see again. Their eyes held a pain that Morrison knew would never fully heal. Dr. Turner analyzed the alien technology they had captured during the rescue mission. The Zelthak. Weapons were designed to cause maximum psychological trauma rather than quick death. They wanted their enemies to suffer before they died or surrendered. Ben Rodriguez approached Morrison before they reached the nearest human starbase. He wanted to volunteer for whatever military action was being planned against the Zelthak. Rodriguez had lost his wife and 2 daughters in the attack, and his face showed the kind of hatred that would never fade. Morrison understood exactly how Rodriguez felt because the same fire was building in his own chest. The Zelthak had made a terrible mistake when they chose to target human families and children. They had awakened something in humanity that had been sleeping since the ancient wars on Earth. Morrison could feel it growing stronger with each passing hour, like a storm gathering strength before it breaks. The news of the colonial massacres reached Earth like a shock wave that changed everything. President Helen Carter stood before the emergency session of the United Earth Assembly with tears in her eyes but steel in her voice. Behind her on the massive screen were images of the destroyed colonies and the faces of 50,000 dead civilians. Carter spoke slowly and clearly so that every word would be remembered. She told the assembled representatives that humanity had tried to make peace with monsters who tortured children for scientific research. The Zelthak Empire had declared war on human civilization by targeting the most innocent among them. The president's speech was broadcast live across all human worlds and space stations. In factories and farms and schools, people stopped what they were doing to listen. Many of them had friends or relatives on the frontier colonies. The images of alien soldiers separating human families burned into their minds like acid. Danny Kim was working the night shift at the manufacturing plant on Luna when the broadcast began. He had a sister living on Harmony 7th who had 2 young children. Danny had not heard from her since the attacks began, and he knew in his heart that she was gone. When President Carter called for volunteers to join the military, Danny was the first person at his plant to sign up. Admiral Tony Blake received orders to begin the largest military mobilization in human history. Every shipyard from Earth to the outer colonies started building warships designed for one purpose. These were not exploration vessels or cargo haulers, but pure weapons of war built to carry humanity's rage across the stars. The mood in human space had changed completely from the peaceful optimism that had marked first contact with the Zelthak. Factory worker Susan Lee quit her job making civilian electronics to help build targeting systems for military weapons. Her teenage daughter had volunteered for the Youth Auxiliary Corps despite being below the normal age requirement. Dr. Alex Turner was assigned to the Military Intelligence Division, where she studied everything known about Zelthak psychology and culture. She realized that the aliens' greatest strength was also their most dangerous weakness. They could not understand human emotional responses because they had never experienced anything like them. Turner's research revealed that the Zelthak made all decisions based on cold logic and mathematical calculations. They could predict human behavior in normal situations, but they had no idea how humans would react when driven by grief and fury. The aliens were fighting an enemy they could not comprehend. President Carter announced that the United Earth Assembly had voted unanimously for a declaration of war against the Zelthak Empire. She promised that humanity would not rest until every human life was avenged and every alien responsible was dead. The vote had taken less than 10 minutes with no debate needed. Major Carlos Rivera was put in charge of interrogating captured Zeltak prisoners from border skirmishes. The aliens seemed genuinely confused by human determination to keep fighting despite suffering heavy casualties. One prisoner named Kethval kept asking why humans did not surrender when defeat seemed mathematically certain. Rivera tried to explain human concepts like honor and revenge to the alien prisoner, but Kethval could not understand them. The Zeltak believed that any action which did not improve survival odds was mental illness. They could not grasp why humans would choose to fight hopeless battles for abstract principles. The Zeltak High Command, led by Supreme Admiral Zixmar, received reports about human military buildup with calm indifference. Their analysts calculated that human industrial capacity was insufficient to challenge Zeltak technological superiority. They dismissed the war preparations as an emotional outburst that would fade when humans faced reality. Captain Jake Morrison was promoted to admiral and given command of the new Fifth Fleet. His ships were crewed by volunteers who had lost family, members in the colonial attacks. These people had joined the military not for pay or glory, but for the chance to kill aliens who murdered children. Morrison noticed something different about his crew compared to the peacetime Navy he had known. Before the war, these sailors worked with grim efficiency and showed no fear during combat training. They had already lost everything that mattered to them, so death in battle held no terror. General Paula Martinez was developing the strategic plans for Operation Righteous Fury, which would be humanity's first major strike against Zeltak territory. She had studied every detail of alien military doctrine and found weaknesses that could be exploited by forces driven by pure hatred rather than tactical logic. The operation would target 17 Zeltak installations simultaneously using the new Rage-class warships that had been designed specifically for this war. These vessels carried more weapons than any ship in human history, and their crews had trained for months to use them with maximum efficiency. Dr. Turner accompanied the fleet as chief xenobiologist to study Zeltak behavior under combat stress. She wanted to understand how the aliens would react when faced with human fury in battle. Her preliminary research suggested that many Zeltak soldiers would simply shut down when confronted with seemingly irrational human aggression. Supreme Admiral Zixmar reviewed intelligence reports about human military preparations and found them amusing rather than concerning. The aliens had calculated that human emotional instability would work against them in organized warfare. They expected human forces to break apart under the stress of actual combat. The Zeltak had never fought an enemy driven by the need for vengeance rather than survival. Their war doctrine was based on defeating rational opponents who would surrender when victory became impossible. They had no strategies for dealing with humans who would rather die fighting than live with defeat. President Carter made another broadcast as the attack fleets prepared to depart. She spoke directly to the families of soldiers who were about to risk their lives in alien territory. Carter promised that their sacrifice would not be forgotten and that humanity would keep fighting until justice was served. Admiral Morrison stood on the bridge of his flagship UES Retribution and watched the other ships in his fleet. Each vessel carried the names of destroyed colonies or murdered civilians painted on their hulls. The crews had requested these markings as reminders of why they were fighting this war. The countdown to Operation Righteous Fury had begun, and Morrison felt something he had never experienced before. It was not fear or excitement, but a cold, burning sensation that seemed to fill his entire body. He realized that this feeling was shared by every human in the fleet, and probably every human alive. Danny. Kim was now a gunner on one of the destroyers accompanying Morrison's fleet. He had completed military training in record time, driven by dreams of his sister's children crying for help that never came. Kim had volunteered for the most dangerous assignment available because he wanted to be as close as possible to the aliens. When the shooting started, Dr. Turner reviewed her final intelligence briefings before the attack began. The Zeltak prisoners had all expressed the same basic confusion about human motivation. They could not understand why humans continued preparing for war instead of negotiating for better surrender terms. The aliens seemed to believe that human, emotional responses were temporary chemical reactions that would fade over time. They expected grief and anger to be replaced by rational self-preservation instincts. Turner knew they were completely wrong about human psychology. Supreme Admiral Zixmar received final reports from his intelligence division about human fleet movements. The aliens were confident that their superior technology and logical battle tactics would easily defeat any human attack. They had no idea that they were about to face an enemy that fought with the fury of a species that had been betrayed. Admiral Morrison gave the order that sent 17 human fleets toward 17 different Zelthak targets. Operation Righteous. Fury had begun, and there would be no retreat until every alien installation was burning wreckage floating in space. The time for diplomacy was over, and the time for vengeance had come. Admiral Jake Morrison watched the tactical display as his fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Zelthak Omega-7 system. The alien station ahead was massive and heavily defended with weapons platforms that could destroy entire fleets. His intelligence report said it housed over 1 million Zelthak civilians and military personnel. Morrison felt no sympathy for the alien families who would die in the next few hours. The Zelthak had made their choice when they decided to torture human children in the name of scientific research. Now they would learn what happened when humanity chose to abandon mercy in favor of justice. The UES Retribution led 16 other warships toward the alien station, while Zelthak defense forces scrambled to respond. Morrison could see the confusion in their movement patterns as alien commanders tried to understand why humans would attack such a heavily fortified target. The logical choice would be to find easier prey elsewhere. Captain Linda Torres commanded the Marine assault forces that would board the station after the fleet broke through its defenses. Her troops were volunteers who had lost family members in the colonial massacres. These Marines had trained for months with only one goal in mind, which was killing as many aliens as possible before they died. The battle began when Zelthak orbital platforms opened fire with energy weapons that lit up space like miniature stars. Human ships took heavy damage, but kept advancing through the defensive fire. Several vessels were destroyed completely, but their crews died without showing any sign of fear or hesitation. Lieutenant Andy Foster piloted his fighter through the maze of enemy fire toward the station's main communication array. His mission was to disable alien coordination systems, but his fighter took critical damage halfway to the target. Foster could have ejected and been rescued, but instead he aimed his crippled ship directly at the communication hub. The explosion. When Foster's fighter hit the communication array, destroyed the entire structure and left the Zelthak defenders unable to coordinate their response. His sacrifice allowed the main fleet to punch through the defensive perimeter and close to weapons range of the station itself. Dr. Alex Turner monitored the battle from the Retribution's science station, where she studied Zelthak behavior patterns during combat. She noticed that many alien soldiers simply stopped functioning when faced with human tactics that made no logical sense. They could not process the concept of willing self-sacrifice for tactical advantage. Sergeant Danny Kim commanded one of the gun crews that poured fire into the alien station's hull. He had painted his sister's name on every shell his gun fired, and whispered her children's names with each shot. Kim's crew worked with mechanical precision that came from months of rage focused into perfect military efficiency. The Zelthak station's defenses began to crumble under the concentrated human assault. Morrison ordered all ships to target civilian areas as well as military installations. He wanted the aliens to understand that humanity no longer distinguished between combatants and non-combatants when it came to a species that experimented on children. Captain Torres led her Marines through breached sections of the station where they encountered Zelthak soldiers in desperate hand-to-hand combat. The aliens fought with sophisticated weapons and superior physical strength, but they could not match human fury in close-quarters battle. Torres watched her troops tear through enemy positions with brutal efficiency. Major Carlos Rivera had studied Zelthak psychology extensively, and he noticed something disturbing in the alien defenders. Many of them seemed to shut down completely when faced with human soldiers who kept fighting despite fatal wounds. The aliens could not understand why humans continued attacking when they should logically be seeking medical attention. Morrison received damage reports showing that his fleet had lost over half its ships in the assault on the station. Under normal circumstances, he would consider retreat to preserve his remaining forces. Instead, he ordered his surviving vessels to ram the station if their weapon systems failed. Death was preferable to allowing any aliens to survive. The station's main reactor core suffered critical damage when the human cruiser UES Vengeance, piloted by Captain Steve Walsh, crashed directly into the facility's power plant. Walsh had volunteered for the suicide mission after learning that his entire family had been killed in the colonial attacks. His sacrifice triggered a chain reaction that destroyed most of the station. Dr. Turner documented the complete psychological breakdown of Zelthak. Command personnel during the final phase of the battle. Intercepted communications showed alien officers requesting permission to surrender, but their superiors seemed unable to process the concept that humans might reject any offer of capitulation. The battle ended with the complete destruction of Zelthak Station Omega-7 and the death of everyone aboard. Morrison counted the cost to his own forces and found that only 4 ships remained operational out of the 17 that had begun the attack. Normally, such casualties would be considered a devastating defeat. Instead, Morrison felt something. That might have been satisfaction as he watched the alien station burning in space. Similar battles were taking place across 17 different star systems as human fleets struck back at their tormentors. The reports coming in showed the same pattern of total human commitment and alien confusion. General Paula Martinez coordinated the overall operation from her command center on Earth, where she received updates from all 17 attack fleets. The human forces were taking massive casualties, but they were achieving their objectives through sheer determination. Every targeted Zelthak installation was either destroyed or heavily damaged. Supreme Admiral Zixmar received the first reports of human attacks with growing disbelief. His analysts had predicted that human forces would use hit-and-run tactics to minimize casualties. Instead, the humans were accepting enormous losses to achieve maximum destruction of Zelthak assets. The alien command structure began showing signs of strain as reports came in from the attacked installations. Zelthak military doctrine had no provisions for dealing with an enemy that seemed to prefer death to defeat. Their tactical computers could not calculate effective responses to seemingly irrational human behavior. Captain Torres and her surviving Marines continued fighting in the wreckage of the alien station even as it broke apart around them. They hunted down every Zelthak survivor with methodical thoroughness that ignored their own safety. Torres had promised her dead daughter that she would kill aliens until her last breath. Morrison's remaining ships began the journey back to human space, carrying recordings of the battle that would be broadcast across all human worlds. These videos showed Zelthak soldiers freezing in panic when faced with human troops who fought like demons possessed by unbreakable hatred, Dr. Turner compiled her observations into a report that would change human military doctrine forever. She had confirmed that Zelthak psychology made them vulnerable to tactics based on emotional commitment rather than logical strategy. The aliens could not predict or counter human behavior driven by pure rage. The 17 simultaneous attacks had achieved more than their tactical objectives. They had sent a message to the Zelthak Empire that humanity was no longer the peaceful species that had sought friendship among the stars. The humans who returned from those battles were something new and terrible that the galaxy had never seen before. Admiral Morrison stood in the wreckage of his flagship's bridge and made a promise to the memory of Andy Foster and Steve Walsh and all the others who had died to make this victory possible. Operation Righteous Fury was only the beginning of humanity's response to alien treachery. The reports from all 17 attack sites told the same story. Human forces had suffered catastrophic casualties but had accomplished total destruction of their targets. More importantly, they had broken something fundamental in Zelthak psychology by demonstrating that humans could not be defeated through superior firepower alone. Supreme Admiral Zixmar called an emergency meeting of the Zelthak High Command to discuss these unprecedented human attacks. For the first time in their species' history, the aliens were facing an enemy that seemed to grow stronger rather than weaker when suffering heavy losses. They did not understand what they had awakened. 2 years had passed since Operation Righteous Fury, and the war had consumed everything in its path. Admiral Jake Morrison commanded the Grand Fleet from his flagship UES Vengeance as 300 human warships approached the Zelthak home system. The alien homeworld lay ahead, protected by orbital defenses that should have made assault impossible. Morrison no longer resembled the peaceful exploration captain who had made first contact with the Zelthak Empire. The war had burned away everything, soft in his character, leaving behind something harder and colder than the vacuum of space. His eyes held the same look shared by every human who had survived the past 2 years of total warfare. General Paula Martinez had spent months planning the assault on Zelthak Prime using intelligence gathered from captured alien installations. The planet's defense systems were designed to stop conventional attacks, but human military doctrine had evolved far beyond conventional warfare. They now fought with tactics that turned every ship and soldier into a guided weapon. The siege began with Admiral Tony Blake's secondary fleet attacking the outer defense platforms while Morrison's ships pushed toward the planet itself. Human vessels took enormous damage but continued advancing through the alien fire. Several cruisers had been converted into massive bombs that their crews would pilot directly into enemy installations. Commander Steve Walsh led the first wave of kamikaze attacks against the planetary defense grid. His ship UES Retribution carried enough explosives to destroy a small moon, and Walsh had volunteered to deliver them personally. He had lost his wife and children in the colonial massacres and considered this mission his chance for final revenge. Dr. Alex Turner monitored alien communications from her station aboard Morrison's flagship. The Zelthak defenders were sending increasingly desperate messages to their command centers describing human behavior that made no sense according to their understanding of warfare. Entire human crews were choosing death over retreat when any logical species would surrender. The orbital defenses that protected Zelthak Prime had been built to stop enemies who valued their own survival above military objectives. The human fleets approaching the planet operated under completely different principles. Every ship captain had orders to ram enemy positions if their weapons failed, and every crew member had accepted that they would not survive the battle. Captain Linda Torres commanded the ground assault forces that would invade the planet's surface after the orbital defenses fell. Her Marines had been training for urban warfare in alien cities where they would show no mercy to civilian populations. The Zelthak had forfeited any claim to protection when they chose to experiment on human children. Supreme Admiral Zixmar watched the human attack from his command center deep beneath the planet's surface. The alien military leader had studied 2 years of human combat footage, but he still could not understand what drove their seemingly suicidal tactics. His tactical computers predicted human defeat within hours, yet the attacking fleets continued advancing. Sergeant Danny Kim operated one of the massive siege guns that pounded Zelthak defensive positions from orbit. He had survived every major battle of the war, and his gun crew had painted the names of destroyed human colonies on their weapon. Kim worked with mechanical precision that came from channeling 2 years of grief into perfect military efficiency. The first orbital platform fell when Commander Walsh's ship punched through its shields and detonated in the reactor core. The explosion lit up the entire system and sent debris raining down on the planet's surface below. Walsh's sacrifice opened a gap in the defense grid that allowed Morrison's ships to advance closer to their target. Major Carlos Rivera led intelligence, teams that had been studying Zelthak psychology throughout the war. His reports showed that alien morale was collapsing across their entire empire as news of human victories spread. Zelthak colonies were surrendering without fighting when human fleets appeared in their systems. The psychological impact of human warfare was destroying Zelthak civilization more effectively than any weapon. The aliens had built their empire on the assumption that all intelligent species valued survival above all other considerations. Humanity had proven that assumption fatally wrong by demonstrating a willingness to die for abstract concepts like justice and revenge. Morrison received reports from other human fleets operating throughout Zelthak space. Admiral Grant's forces had captured the major industrial world of Kethval Prime, while Admiral Rivera's ships were systematically destroying alien research facilities where humans had been tortured. The war had spread across hundreds of star systems. Dr. Turner's psychological analysis of captured Zelthak officers revealed complete mental breakdown in many cases. High Commander Vexathon, who had led the original negotiations with humanity, was now confined to a medical facility after suffering what alien doctors called logical cascade failure. He could no longer process information that contradicted his understanding of rational behavior. The second wave of human attacks focused on the planet's major population centers, where millions of Zelthak civilians lived and worked. Morrison had ordered the systematic destruction of alien cities to demonstrate that humanity no longer recognized any distinction between military and civilian targets. The Zelthak had taught humans this lesson when they attacked the colonies. Captain Torres and her Marines landed on the planet's surface through gaps in the defense grid torn open by kamikaze attacks. They found Zelthak civilians huddled in underground shelters where they waited for death to find them. The aliens showed no resistance because their military doctrine had no provisions for fighting an enemy that seemed to enjoy warfare. Supreme. Admiral Zixmar made the decision that would seal his species' fate when he authorized the use of planet-killer weapons against remaining human colonies. He believed that sufficient destruction would finally break human morale and force them to negotiate surrender. Instead, it added fuel to a fire that was already consuming everything in its path. The news of additional colonial destruction reached human forces as they tightened their grip around Zelthak Prime. Morrison felt something snap inside his mind when he learned that the aliens had murdered another 1 million human civilians. He gave new orders that would ensure no Zelthak anywhere in the galaxy would survive to threaten humanity again. General Martinez coordinated the final assault on the planet's surface, using tactics that prioritized alien suffering over military efficiency. Human forces moved slowly through Zelthak cities, destroying everything they found while broadcasting recordings of human children crying for their murdered parents. The psychological warfare was more devastating than conventional weapons. Admiral Blake's fleet had broken through the last orbital defenses and begun bombardment of the planet's surface. The weapons they used had been designed specifically to cause maximum terror among alien populations. Cities burned with fires that could be seen from space, while human ships circled overhead like vultures waiting for prey to die. Dr. Turner intercepted the final communications from Zelthak command centers as their civilization collapsed around them. The messages were filled with pleas for mercy and offers of unconditional surrender, but human forces no longer accepted alien surrenders. The time for negotiation had ended when the first human child died in an alien laboratory. Morrison stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched Zelthak Prime burning beneath him. The planet that had been the center of an empire spanning thousands of worlds was now a dying ember in space. He felt no satisfaction from the destruction because it could never bring back the people who had been murdered in the colonial attacks. The war would continue until every Zelthak world was reduced to ash, and every alien who had participated in the genocide of human families was dead. Morrison's orders from Earth were clear and simple. Humanity would show the galaxy what happened to species that made the mistake of harming human children. Captain Torres sent her final report from the planet's surface where her Marines had completed their mission of extermination. The last Zelthak strongholds had fallen, and no alien survivors remained in the major population centers. The homeworld of a species that had ruled space for millennia was now a graveyard, filled only with smoke and silence. Supreme Admiral Zixmar made one last desperate transmission before human forces reached his underground bunker. He begged for mercy and promised that the Zelthak would never again threaten humanity if they were allowed to survive. His message was received and recorded, but no human commander bothered to respond. The war ended not with surrender or peace treaties, but with the complete extinction of Zelthak civilization across every world they had ever touched. President Helen Carter stood in the ruins of the Alien High Command Center on their homeworld. While human soldiers methodically destroyed the last traces of the empire that had ruled the galaxy for thousands of years, Carter had aged decades in the 3 years since the war began, but her eyes still burned with the same cold fire that had driven humanity across the stars. Around her, the smoking remains of Zelthak Prime stretched to the horizon, where cities that had housed millions now lay in rubble. The aliens who had once dismissed humans as emotional primitives were learning the true cost of that mistake. Admiral Jake Morrison coordinated the final phase of extermination from his flagship orbiting high above the dead planet. His orders from Earth were simple and absolute. Every Zelthak world would be sterilized, and every alien installation would be reduced to scattered atoms floating in space. There would be no survivors and no prisoners, because humanity had chosen to ensure this could never happen again. The systematic destruction had taken months to complete as human fleets moved from system to system, eliminating every trace of Zelthak presence. Admiral Tony Blake commanded the forces that hunted down fleeing alien ships, while General Paula Martinez led ground operations that cleared alien worlds of all life. The work was methodical and thorough, like surgeons removing a cancer. Dr. Alex Turner compiled the final psychological analysis of Zelthak civilization during its death throes. The aliens had never understood what they were fighting until the very end, when human forces surrounded their last strongholds. In their final communications, the Zelthak had begged for explanations of why humans would not accept surrender or negotiate peace. Turner's report documented the complete mental breakdown of an entire species that had built their empire on cold logic and mathematical precision. When faced with an enemy driven by grief and rage rather than tactical advantage, the Zelthak command structure had simply collapsed. They could not fight what they could not comprehend. Captain Linda Torres led the teams that secured the underground bunkers where Zelthak leaders had tried to hide from human justice. She found Supreme Admiral Zixmar cowering in a reinforced shelter deep beneath the planet's surface. The alien who had ordered the murder of human children was now begging for mercy that would never come, Torres remembered her own daughter's face from the colony attack recordings as she looked down at the trembling alien commander. Zixmar kept asking why humans would not listen to reason and accept logical solutions to their conflict. Torres did not bother explaining that some crimes could only be answered with extinction. Major Carlos Rivera had spent the final months of the war interrogating the last Zelthak prisoners before they were executed. The aliens remained baffled by human behavior even as they faced death. They could not understand why humans continued fighting long after achieving military victory instead of negotiating for resources and territory. One prisoner named Keth Val had repeatedly asked Rivera to explain human motivation for continuing a war that served no practical purpose. Rivera had tried to make the alien understand concepts like justice and vengeance, but Kethval could only process actions in terms of survival advantage. He died still confused about why humans cared about abstract principles. The last Zelthak fleet was destroyed in the Outer Rim territories by Admiral Morrison's forces after a chase that lasted 6 months. The alien ships had been trying to reach unexplored space where they might establish new colonies far from human anger. Morrison's crews tracked them down and eliminated every vessel without offering terms for surrender. Morrison stood on his bridge and watched the final alien ship explode in a brief flash of light against the star field. The war that had begun, with peaceful first contact, was ending with the complete genocide of a species that had ruled space when humanity was still trapped on Earth. The galaxy would remember this lesson for millennia to come. Dr. Turner's final report became required. Reading at every military academy in human space. She had documented how the Zelthak's inability to understand human emotions had led directly to their extinction. The aliens had studied human love and hope and joy, but they had never bothered to study human hatred when those precious things were destroyed. The Zelthak had made their calculations based on the assumption that all intelligent species would choose survival over principles when faced with superior force. They had never encountered a species that could love so deeply it would burn down the universe to protect what it cherished most. That miscalculation had cost them everything. President Carter addressed the United Earth Assembly for the final time as the last reports of Zelthak extermination reached home. She spoke about the price of the war and the changes it had brought to human civilization. Humanity had learned terrible lessons about what they were capable of when pushed beyond all limits of tolerance. The galaxy had fallen silent around human space as news of the Zelthak extinction spread to other alien civilizations. Species that had existed for millions of years looked at their star charts and realized that an empire older than their recorded history had been completely erased by newcomers who had barely left their home system. Admiral Morrison received the final casualty report showing that humanity had lost over 40% of its military forces during the 3-year war. Entire fleets had been sacrificed in attacks that served no strategic purpose except to inflict maximum damage on alien populations. The human cost had been enormous, but the price had been paid willingly. Captain Torres submitted her last field report describing the completion of ground operations on the final Zelthak world. Her Marines had worked for weeks to ensure that no alien survivors remained hidden in underground shelters or remote settlements. The job was finished, and the species that had tortured human children was gone forever. The economic cost of the war had bankrupted most human worlds, but nobody complained about the sacrifice. Danny Kim returned to his factory job on Luna, but now he built monuments to the dead instead of civilian goods. His sister's children would never grow up, but their deaths had been avenged in a way that would terrify potential enemies for generations. Dr. Turner archived the final Zelthak transmission that had been sent to unknown recipients somewhere in deep space. The message was a warning broadcast to any alien species that might be listening. It described humans as a species driven by emotions so powerful they could sustain total warfare for years without any hope of material gain. The warning told other aliens to avoid contact with humanity at all costs because humans would respond to any threat against their families with complete extermination of the threatening species. The Zelthak's final gift to the galaxy was an accurate description of what they had learned too late about their human neighbors. Morrison disbanded his fleet as the last ships returned to human space carrying soldiers who had been changed forever by 3 years of total war. These veterans would spend the rest of their lives remembering alien worlds burning under human weapons. They had seen what their species could become when love was transformed into hatred. The galaxy stretched empty and silent around human territory, where once the Zelthak Empire had ruled from thousands of worlds. Other alien civilizations read the warning messages and made careful note of where human space ended. They had learned from Zelthak mistakes and would not repeat them. President Carter's final speech was broadcast to every human world and became part of the historical record that would be studied for centuries. She reminded her people that they had tried to be explorers and diplomats and friends to the aliens they met among the stars. The Zelthak had taught them to be something far more terrible. The aliens could not comprehend human rage when it began as grief for murdered children. They had dismissed human emotions as primitive weaknesses right up until those emotions consumed their entire civilization. In the end, they understood perfectly, but their understanding came far too late to save them from the fire they had lit. The war was over, and humanity stood alone among the stars, surrounded by the ashes of their enemies. They had learned that love and hatred were two faces of the same coin, and that a species capable of infinite compassion was also capable of infinite cruelty. The galaxy would remember this lesson and fear them for it.